Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. It's great to be back for this first episode of 2026. Hope you all enjoyed the festive break and you're having a good start to the year. So far here in Cornwall, it's been very cold and frosty, which I quite like as I can just hunker down and do my research and a bit of recording. Thank you to all of you who've been listening to the series so far, and to the fantastic patrons over on Patreon. A quick date for your diary. On the 21st of January, I'm going to be bringing my talk exploring dark tales of Cornish smuggling to St Austell Library, and you can find out more about that event on my Instagram and Facebook pages. Some exciting news is that this spring I'm going to be collaborating again with the wonderful Elizabeth Dale, aka the Cornish Bird, for a new series of talks. I'm also going to be teaming up with the brilliant Mark Norman, host of the Folklore podcast, for another brand new talk as well. So I'll be keeping you all updated on the details for those in the coming weeks. Right, that's it for news, so let's crack on with the episode. I've always been fascinated by the city of Exeter, ever since I was a student there quite a few years ago now. I love the atmosphere of the place, but there's also so much history there. And each time I visit, I find myself wandering around some of the old buildings that still survive. And if you haven't been, then I highly recommend checking out the cathedral, especially if, like me, you're a bit of a geek for medieval architecture. I've talked about this before in a previous episode, but it was years ago, as a student, that I was walking around the city and I encountered this plaque that had been put up near the castle gatehouse and which bore the names of several women from Bideford who had been tried and executed for witchcraft in the late 17th century. Temperance Lloyd, Susanna Edwards, Mary Trembles, and Alice Moland. Now, we explored their story a while back, so if you haven't listened to that episode, I recommend checking that out. But I can still remember reading those names, and instantly I was fascinated, and I wanted to know more. And looking back on it now, I have to wonder whether it was that moment that sparked my interest in researching historical witchcraft cases. People may well be familiar with the story of the Bideford witches, but I wanted to try and discover other stories from Devon that perhaps aren't talked about as much. So last year I was researching for a talk on Devon witchcraft when I came across a brilliant book by Professor Mark Stoyle entitled Witchcraft in Exeter, 1558 to 1660. Which I highly recommend. And there were some really interesting cases in there that were new to me. I'd encountered Mark's work before, some years ago when I was researching for the episode on Cornish ghost layers, and I read his article on the Gear Rout of 1648, as well as his amazing book on the Western Rising of 1549, which I've popped a link to in the show notes, by the way. So, whilst reading this book on witchcraft in Exeter, I thought I'd drop Mark an email to see if he might be interested in chatting about the subject. Shortly afterwards, I got an email back from Mark who agreed to have a chat. So, a few weeks back, we sat down to discuss the topic, and in this episode, you're going to be hearing from our conversation as we explore some of these 16th and 17th century witchcraft cases from Exeter. So, without further ado, here's our next episode, Witchcraft in Exeter, with Professor Mark Stoyle. Dionysia Baldwin is accustomed to receive John de Wormhill and Agnes his wife, and Joan Lacorn Wallace of Teignmouth, who are witches and enchanters. A translation there from the City Court record that I found mentioned in a book called Witchcraft in Old and New England by George Leman Kittredge, referring to a rare early example from Exeter in the medieval period, way back in 1302. I was intrigued to know more about some of the other cases from Exeter, and so in December I sat down to chat with Professor Mark Stoyle, a historian who's from Devon, and Mark is currently Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Southampton. I began by asking Mark about growing up in Devon and when his passion for history started.
Well, I suppose one of the first things I wanted to ask was how did you, what sparked sort of growing up in Devon, what kind of sparked your initial sort of passion for history, and particularly local history, I suppose?
Oh gosh, it's really hard to answer that. I mean, I've always been really interested in the past. So I grew up in sort of rural mid-Devon, and obviously that's really quiet and quite traditional. And there was still, it felt very different still. There were lots of local people who'd sort of tell stories about things that happened in the village in the past. And I just found myself being really drawn to that. I really enjoyed doing history at school, had really good school teachers. And then I think when I left school, I'd already decided I wanted to do something history related in my career. So then I became an archaeologist. So I went to work with the archaeologists in Exeter, and that was an amazing historical apprenticeship. So I spent a whole year digging in Exeter and doing sort of documentary work in Exeter, and that's where it really sort of took off, I think.
Amazing. And am I right in thinking that you were kind of doing bits and bobs at Bickley Castle as well?
Yes, that was the job that I did when I was at school.
Amazing.
So Bickley was like a local village to us. So I used to cycle to Bickley and take people around the castle. The owners who lived there at that time were lovely. They had a little series of guides, and they were mainly either retired people or very young people, sort of, teenagers. And that was great as well. I mean, that's the first time I actually got to speak to other people about history, really.
Do you think that kind of helped feed your passion, kind of passing on that knowledge that you began to sort of pick up already?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it is that sense of, I mean, Bickley's a beautiful place. It's really close to where we lived. I think I felt, it's really fun to talk about this place that I really love with lots of people who are coming down to enjoy it as well. And obviously, you've got a very receptive audience there, people who are there for a day out and they just want to sort of take in the atmosphere and the history. So it was a really nice group of people to sort of start public speaking with.
That sounds like an amazing kind of way to start your career, essentially.
It was, yeah, exactly. So even before I'd left school, I was already used to kind of talking to people about history, and I could see how, as you were saying earlier, it does tend to ignite some people's passion. I mean, not everyone's interested, but lots of people really are. And that was fun as well, the shared enthusiasm.
And I guess sort of leading on from that, in terms of passion, we're going to kind of go on to talk and discuss the topic of witchcraft. How do you kind of arrive at that topic, and how has that kind of continued to sort of fascinate you, I suppose?
Well, I mean, it's really feeding out of the same thing. So when I started working with the archaeologists, really enjoyed that sort of getting into the city of Exeter's past. So that's what I was doing in the day. And this was the 80s. So there was a nightclub called the Timepiece in Exeter.
I know it well.
Up by the castle. And those were the sort of the Gothic days. So there were all these sort of Gothic nights, and with all these people dressed as witches and coming to hear this. And so I really enjoyed that sort of subculture at that time, being in my late teens, early 20s. And then I suddenly realised that nightclub is built on the prison where they kept the last witches to be hanged in England. And I can remember sitting in the nightclub and watching all these people coming out looking like witches and thinking there were witches, actual witches who were executed here 300 years before. And then a few years after that, someone put up a monument to the Exeter witches. And I think that really managed to make more Exeter people, think about the history of that. So all of those things coming together sort of in the 80s, early 90s, then I got really interested in witchcraft in Exeter. And my wife and I were living in the middle of Exeter at that time. She was really interested in the witch sort of angle as well. And that's when I first came across some sort of original documents relating to witches, actually in a Victorian book. And so it sort of took off from there. But I would have been about 20, I guess, when I first got interested in this.
That's amazing and it's fascinating because I first encountered kind of in the same way while I was studying at Exeter. I came
Yeah.
across the memorial, the plaque,
Yes.
and that made me then go, I want to know more about these women who'd been accused, and I wanted to find out more about their stories.
Yeah.
But because we're going to be kind of talking about the sort of 1500s, 1600s, do you
Yeah.
have a sense of what Exeter would have been like during that period?
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the interesting things is that Exeter was one of the biggest cities in the kingdom at that time. So if we're looking sort of between about Henry VIII's reign and the Civil War, Exeter was always in the top 10 biggest cities, and sometimes it was in the top sort of 5 or 6. So it was a really important place, very populous. Obviously, the centre of the West Country, like it's been since Roman times, the sort of the provincial capital of Devon and Cornwall. And we think that the population on the eve of the Civil War was between about 10,000 and 12,000, which doesn't sound a lot today, but it was enormous in contemporary terms. So it's a very important city. The other amazing thing about Exeter as a historian is that it has a very, very rich set of civic archives. So I started working on them when I was an archaeologist, and I just suddenly realised this is incredibly rich and there's more stuff to be found here.
And is that, well, in terms of finding the accounts and the cases that you did, was that quite a tricky process? Because I imagine, first off, I imagine a lot of these things documents are in Latin to begin with. Is it a kind of tricky and a sort of slow process of going through these meticulously and literally translating them?
It really is. So, I mean, again, I was very lucky, I think, working with the archaeologists, that they gave me opportunity not just to dig, but also to go into the archives. Because by that time, I decided I wanted to go on to university to do history and archaeology. So they said, well, it'd be really good if you did some archival work. And that's when I really began to look at original documents. And I mean, they were tricky. So I first learnt to read sort of Stuart documents in English, which is hard enough because the writing is so bad. And then gradually, with the help of people I was working with there, I began to be able to read the Tudor documents. And then really over the course of many years since, I've got better at reading the Latin. I'm still not a good Latinist, but I can read it now and work out, what's going on. And that was crucial really for doing the further research on witches.
Did doing that unlock the ability does it change a lot if you try to go further back and look at earlier cases in terms of spelling and language and things like that, because you're looking at almost sort of Middle English if you're trying to go further back towards the medieval period? Does that make it that bit trickier again because language has evolved so much by that point in the city?
I think so. I mean, also, I'm not a medieval specialist, but medievalists tell me that actually medieval writing is very easy to read once you've got the knack of it, because it tends to be quite standard, and the people doing it are usually very well educated. They know exactly what they're doing. So if you can read one, you can read most of them. When you get into the Tudor period, oddly enough, because education is kind of spreading and there are more people sort of lower down the social scale writing, often their writing's really terrible. And they're very, very different. They write really different scripts. Some are beautiful and easy to read, and some are completely villainous and almost illegible. And it was moving from the simple scripts, if you like, and then trying to decipher some of this really crabbed and difficult handwriting. And, that took me a long time. And even now, there are documents I come across that I still just can't really decipher.
It's a tricky question to answer, I suppose, but in terms of cases sort of pre-1500, are they really rare to come across? Because you mention a case that I've also found mention of in the past in 1302.
Yes.
Yeah, Joan Le Cornwallis.
That's right.
And then is it John and Agnes de Wormhill or something like that?
To be honest, I can't remember, but that's a case that I've never looked at in the original myself. I actually took that reference from a Victorian historian who'd looked at those earlier documents. So to be honest, I very rarely look at anything before 1485 because I'm just not very good at dealing with it. I usually have to ask for, medieval colleagues to help me with that. But the interesting thing on this really is that witchcraft doesn't become a crime, a secular crime, until the 1540s. So it's really only after that you begin to get a lot of witchcraft cases in the courts. So that's helpful for me, obviously, because that's the area that I'm more familiar with.
Yeah, it really feels like it's sort of, we start to find a lot more records post these sort of witchcraft acts, I guess, under Henry VIII.
Yes.
repealed, but then, am I right in thinking brought back in, is it about 1563?
Yes, it's Elizabeth. Yeah.
And so I guess we tend to find sort of more cases, but you sort of mentioned one that's interesting to me because it seems quite early that it comes from, is it John Hooker talking about under Bishop, is it Hugh Oldham?
Yes, it is.
That's a really interesting case because that seems like quite an early sort of during, is it, would it be under Henry's reign?
Yes,
Something like that.
earlier in Henry's reign, before I think that act was passed. I mean, this is it. There had always been this belief in witchcraft in England, and people had always been accused of bewitching their neighbours and doing black magic and white magic. But before the first act was passed, the statute against it, it was tried by the ecclesiastical authorities. And it wasn't seen as quite such an appalling crime. It was obviously thought to be bad. People shouldn't be doing it. But the punishments were much lighter. People would have to do penance. They would perhaps be, told to sort of apologize in public to the people they'd harmed, or to do some sort of humiliating sort of recantation of what they'd done. But the secular courts couldn't actually hand out capital punishments. So most of these alleged witches, were just accused, kind of dealt with, and then sort of disappeared back into their communities again.
Amazing. So they kind of just processed and then the life carries on, if you like.
Yes. I mean, effectively, don't do it again is what the church courts say.
That's fascinating. What's particularly interesting in this example is we've got, is it a suspected witch from Crediton?
Crediton, yeah.
Oldham is sort of described as having treated her particularly harshly.
Yes.
But then he falls ill.
Yeah.
And Hooker is quite kind of sort of slates him for kind of resorting in the end to this alleged witch to help him to heal.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, we don't know the absolute truth of the story because it's being told by Hooker later. But I think this is why witchcraft was so powerful, really, in the period, that a lot of people, when they felt really ill, when one of their children was ill, or they were having terrible problems losing all of their animals, they would turn in the last resort to witchcraft. And Hooker, obviously, as a post-Reformation writer, is very down on the Catholic Church, and he sees it as being sort of superstitious, and in some ways kind of much more friendly to witchcraft than Protestants would have been. So while he's telling that story, I mean, he's telling us a fascinating story, but in a way, he's kind of getting a punch in at the pre-Reformation Catholic Church as well.
Okay, so this is almost a kind of highlighting beliefs in the past and how much it sort of references, it sort of makes a point about how much has changed and how those old beliefs are old hat, and that shouldn't be the way of things anymore, sort of thing.
That certainly one shouldn't have any recourse to witchcraft. I mean, Hooker tells us another really interesting story about Bishop Grandison, who's probably the most famous medieval bishop, and we still have the Grandison service at the cathedral every year at Christmas. And again, he was sort of, almost everyone felt he was a really good bishop and very, very learned, did all sorts of good things. But Hooker actually, again, writing post-Reformation, claims or suggests that Grandison may have had familiar spirits that he used to look into the future, which again is a very dodgy thing to say about a man of the church.
Yeah, it's this weird thing. I've sort of a while back I was speaking to a historian called Dr. Charlotte Mackenzie about, at one point there was this idea in Cornwall of people who were known as knowing men.
Yes.
And people of a certain has to be said sort of status, like wealthy farmers, but they were looking at things like divination, or they were looking rumored to be dabbling in alchemy, but also there was sort of occult links and suggestions there. So there's an interesting crossover sometimes between clergy, but also this sort of occult and magical side, which is a weird blend.
Exactly. I mean, it's very interesting when you look at the history of witchcraft as a whole. You have these sort of high status educated men who are often seen as kind of, they can do magic. They're sort of, as you say, they're in touch with sort of occult lore, but they're not actually witches. And then at the other end of the scale, you get these poor, usually illiterate, elderly women who are seen as black witches. So there's something quite gendered there as well, and obviously about social class and education. So that's a really interesting dynamic.
It is, and it actually kind of ties in, it sort of leads us on nicely to the first individual that really stood out to me, because some of these people, and what I love is you really start to wonder about these people as individuals and desire to wish you could have met them, to have known more.
Yeah.
First person who stood out to me is Matilda. We think Matilda Park or Maud.
Yes.
who's accused in, is it 1565, of using magic art,
Yes.
which is such a broad
Yeah.
term. But you get the sense that she's had this ongoing feud with this family called the Marshalls.
That's right.
And am I right in thinking that 3 years earlier, Maud is attacked by Thomas Marshall?
Yes.
Presumably, he thinks that his family have come under some kind of magical attack or something at the hands of Maud.
Yeah.
Do you think that some of these accusations come or stem from sort of neighborly feuds and rivalries? Or do you think that some of it is also down to strong beliefs at this time around sort of magic and witchcraft, and there were genuinely people that were thought in the community and suspected of being witches? Or is it kind of a blend of a bit of both?
It's exactly that. Yeah, precisely. That the belief in witchcraft is almost universal at this time. I mean, even Hooker himself, although he's sort of knocking at these pre-Reformation clerics for using witchcraft, he believes in it. It's just he thinks that you shouldn't resort to it, but he definitely believes it exists. And obviously, he's perhaps the most educated and scholarly man in Exeter at that time. So almost everyone, certainly in the Elizabethan period, believes in witchcraft. So there is this sense that you're always sort of looking around. If something bad happens, you think, well, who should I blame for this? And within communities, there are certainly people who are, reputed to be witches. They may be actually white witches, cunning men and women who are trying to help neighbours, through occult law, if you like. But of course, if things go wrong, it's very easy to say, well, they're not good witches at all, they're bad witches. So it is exactly as you say, Keith, it's a combination. It's almost everyone believes in this stuff. And then when nasty things happen to people, they tend to blame neighbours. And there's a kind of mechanism, I don't know if you've come across this, called charity denied.
Yes.
So the idea that, particularly poor elderly people living in the parish will have to sort of go around begging from their wealthier neighbours. Often the neighbours get fed up and turn them away without giving them anything. And at that point, the sort of disappointed supplicant for aid will sort of go away mumbling and cursing. And, 99 times out of 100, that's all that happens. But if then next day, the wealthy family's child falls ill, or one of them suddenly finds themselves covered in lice or something like that, they'll think it's because I turned away, old Mrs. Bloggs yesterday. So it's often those people in that position of being very poor, marginal, begging for charity, who then find themselves, confronted with these accusations.
And what amazes me is the sometimes resorting to violence.
Yeah.
Kind of ensues. In this case, I think you kind of talk about and mention in the book that one of the servants who kind of gives their testimony, the servant in the Marshall family, said that she had been told to go, and Thomas, following this attack on Maud, realizes he's dropped his knife or dagger at the scene, sends his servant to kind of go and retrieve it. But then later a bell tolls in the city, and there's this quote of, it is no matter, it is but an old witch gone. As he's told, oh, that bell's tolling for Maud. That I find fascinating because Thomas doesn't come across as particularly likable at all.
He's a horrible man. He gets into all sorts of problems. I mean, I didn't go into that in the book, but he is obviously a real troublemaker. He's already accused someone else of being a witch before, and the city authorities have kind of, because she was quite a high status woman, they've clearly not taken that on board. They're actually blaming Thomas for calling her this. So he seems to be someone who had lots of enemies. He's violent, he's troublesome. Yeah, he's bad news.
But I suppose on the other side, we have to think about Maud, and she's kind of bound over to sort of keep the peace or to be of good behaviour to the Marshalls. So there's clearly animosity on both sides there.
Yes.
But a couple of years later, 1565, she's again accused of using magic art. And again, she appears before the justices. But this time, the sort of sentence passed upon her is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
In that she's effectively banished.
Yes.
From the city of Exeter.
Yes.
I find that quite unusual as a sort of punishment in a way.
Well, again, I think what's so interesting about this is that in the past, this is what people had tended to do with witches, that they would be sort of told off, told not to do it again. And then if they persisted, they could be sent to the ecclesiastical court, or there would be some other way of getting rid of them. And the city had always banished people it didn't like. So it would banish prostitutes, it would banish vagrants. And so witches are kind of, or alleged witches are kind of being put into this category. And I think what happens is when Elizabeth brings in this new act saying that witches can actually be executed, I think a number of local authorities are probably quite alarmed by this. They think, well, we didn't used to execute these people. Can we really execute them for something that we was just really giving them a bit of a tap, or not exactly a slap over the wrist, but, punishing much less harshly in the past? So I think there's a certain resistance to it in some areas. Rather than being keen to persecute, some local magistrates actually think, well, should we really be doing this? So I think that's why they reach for an option which is still horrible to be banished, but is not like the nuclear option of execution.
What's interesting, I suppose, is that it kind of doesn't work, it seems, because she's not gone for very long.
Yeah.
So she kind of appears again, I think it's only a few months later, isn't it?
Yes.
Back before the justices, this time, I think accused of someone, is it Joanna Clark?
I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yes, another accusation, yeah.
And alongside another woman who, again, you kind of wonder about her as well, Alice Mead, I think.
That's it. We don't know very much about her at all, I'm afraid. Of Exmouth.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
She's kind of accused of bewitching this man in Exeter, and they both appear before the justices. And it looks like they're found guilty, but frustratingly, as is often the case, it seems like the outcome's unclear.
Exactly. I mean, we know that in this case, they are both actually found guilty and condemned to death. So they may well indeed have been executed, but we don't have the hard evidence to prove it. Because one of the points that I think is not always appreciated about witchcraft as a crime is that very often people are not executed. They may be either found not guilty, which is true in many cases, or they're found guilty and then they're subsequently reprieved. And again, that happens not all the time, but more often than one might expect. So I think it's very likely that these two women were executed because that's what the court judgment says should happen to them. But because we don't have a record of the execution, we can't be absolutely sure. But as far as I know, Maud doesn't pop up again in the records. Now, again, that might not mean anything because she's at the bottom of the social heap. It's very hard to track down poor women through the records. So she may have survived and gone on living happily in Exeter, but she may have been executed. At the moment, I'm afraid, as you say, it's frustrating. We just don't know.
It's so tantalizing, isn't it? But then we come across cases where the outcome is much clearer.
Yes.
And this is possibly the individual that really stood out, I found really fascinating. This is Thomasin Short.
Yeah.
We're kind of in the 1580s. And she's accused of basically bewitching the family of a man. I think, is it Richard Hugh, who's like a weaver?
Oh, yes, it's certainly a weaver living on X Island. Oh, I can't remember his name, but he's certainly a weaver anyway. And she's supposed to have attacked his wife and two children.
But alongside that, it seems like she already has a bit of a rep with the city authorities.
Definitely.
And you mentioned she's from kind of St Sidwell's, which is sort of in the east of the city.
Yeah.
You kind of mentioned that. Did the area have a sort of reputation for lawlessness or something like that?
It did. I mean, St Sidwell's has always been the most sort of rumbustious part of Exeter. So it actually lies outside the city walls, of course. Most of the Exeter parishes lie within. This is a suburb. It belongs to the Dean and Chapter, so it's not under exactly the same authority as the city at the beginning of this period, though eventually the citizens managed to extend their jurisdiction over it. And it's always been a poor and disorderly parish. It's where lots of people, obviously Exeter has a lot of in-migration, very poor people often sort of leaving the countryside because they can't survive there, coming to Exeter, hoping to find work, often living on charity. It's always been like the sort of the immigrant area of Exeter from the surrounding countryside. So, it's populous, it's turbulent. The city doesn't quite have the same control over it as it does over the intramural parishes within the city walls. So St Sidwell's has always had this fascinating reputation. And to me, it is probably the most interesting of all the Exeter parishes.
And it's a parish that seems to keep cropping up in some of these cases as well.
St Sidwell's is like, it's witchcraft central in the southwest. There are more cases of witchcraft found in St Sidwell's than anywhere else. And I think it's because it has this particular concentration of very poor and marginal people who are always those who are most likely to be accused of witchcraft.
And what fascinates me in this case is that I think it's 1562, so like a number of years before these later accusations, she's ordered to receive this punishment, basically, which is it towed at the back of a boat through the River Exe?
Exactly right.
For the crime of scolding. And I guess, am I right in thinking that a scold is basically someone who's deemed troublesome or disruptive in the community?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, again, this is a fascinating sort of designation because there's, for a long, long time, medieval period and early modern period as well, there was this concept of the scold, the troublesome, quarrelsome person who creates sort of ruckus in the local community. But fascinatingly, 90% of those who are actually accused and punished for being scolds are women. So it's very much a female crime. You do get the odd male scold, but it's quite rare. And those proportions are almost exactly the same in witchcraft cases as well. 90% of accused witches in England are women and 90% of accused scolds as well. So there's an interesting crossover there.
Do you think that this punishment that's doled out, to me, it's really reminiscent of the idea of the ducking stool?
Yeah.
Do you think it serves the same kind of purpose? It's a sort of public humiliation and sort of public punishment doled out by the community, if you like?
Yeah. I mean, there are parallels, but there are also differences. So I think what you've got here, the ducking stool is usually just for one person. So, it would be one person who'd be ducked in the water. The idea, just as you say, is to shame people in front of the community. But what we've got here, which is more unusual, is a whole group of scolds being dragged through the river at the stern of a boat. And the reason they choose this particular spot, I mean, sure you know it, Keith, it's where the mill on the Exe is now.
Yeah, I know.
So
well.
They choose that spot because that was the very spot where the women of Exeter gathered to wash their clothes. So they'd all come down to the river there and wash their clothes. There would always be lots of women there. That area where the pub stands now was known as the Launder's Plat or the Laundress's Field. So by punishing these four women for their scolding there, in full view of the place where most of the women of the city gather, again, they're making a very sort of gendered point here. And they're sort of saying to the other women of Exeter, don't be scolds, effectively.
It's amazing. I love like finding these little nuggets of information about parts of everyday life within the city and why, in this instance, punishments are meted out in very specific locations.
Exactly. And I mean, it would have been a horrible thing, as you say, everyone would have been watching. She and her sort of fellow accused would be dragged through the water. They'd be brought out really dishevelled, sort of humiliated. Obviously, when women were being ducked, there was also the chance, bits of their clothing would fall out and be sort of unarranged so that they would be kind of exposed in a way that would have been seen as very sort of unseemly at the time. I mean, they were always ducked fully clothed, but still, it's a horrible punishment.
Definitely there's a sort of element of shaming there going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
But things seem to kind of get worse for her from about sort of late 1580 when this weaver's, I think it's his wife and daughter and son all sort of pass away in quick succession. And Thomasin is blamed for this.
Yeah.
So she's again kind of brought before the justices and she's found guilty. What really interests me is you kind of write in the book, she seems to be the first person we have a definite record for who is sentenced to be executed and seems to have been hanged.
Yes. I mean, in the whole of southwest England, as far as I know, or certainly in the whole of Devon and Cornwall, I should stress, she is the very first person that we can prove was executed. So we know that the two women that you mentioned earlier were certainly found guilty of witchcraft and condemned to death in the 1560s. So they may have been the first, but we can't be sure. But in the case of Thomasine Short, we can be sure because there is actually a record. By this time, we have much better burial registers. There is this reference to her actually being buried after she had been hanged. So we know that the sentence was carried out in her case. So it is a very significant case, as you say. And now we can be sure that from this time onwards, the Exeter authorities, the justice of the peace, were prepared to hang accused witches, or convicted witches at least.
So yeah, by the time of the 1580s, things have changed quite a bit in terms of people's outlook on this.
Exactly, because essentially Elizabeth's Act, which is passed in 1563, this sort of opens the floodgates for witchcraft prosecution on a much larger scale. And I think it's partly because the authorities have kind of given a lead. If they're saying, well, this crime is really serious. People can be executed for it. Obviously, population as a whole thinks, wow, this must be bad if the government's doing this. And obviously now this is also a way to get rid of witches in your community for good. So for all sorts of reasons, the number of accusations really burgeon after the 1560s. And by now, loads of people have been executed all over the south of England for witchcraft. So the Exeter justices would think, well, we're just doing what everyone else is doing.
It's really interesting. What stands out to me, and a sort of question I was going to ask really, is I find it interesting that one might expect there might be a certain practice for those who had been accused of something like witchcraft. I find it interesting that it seems that she's buried in the churchyard.
Yeah, I mean, we can't be 100% sure of that. I think she is, because it's noted down in the parish register. So the burial is noted in the parish register of St Sidwell's of Thomasine Sharp suspensus, in other words, having been hanged. But it is just possible that the clerk was actually simply recording the deaths of all the people in the parish, and that in fact she could have been buried at the gallows, at Exeter Gallows, in a pit, as was often done with witches elsewhere. We can't be absolutely sure about this, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I just wondered if there was this sort of element of deviant burial practice for certain individuals, sort of thing that may be going on.
Yeah, I mean, I expect you sort of gleaned this, Keith, that we had two gallows at this time. We had the county of Exeter gallows, which was in Magdalen Road, and then there's a separate gallows for the county of Devon, which is in Hevertree. So at both those places, executions of witches take place, and we know that at Hevertree, those who were executed there were certainly buried there. But we're not quite sure whether those who were buried at the Exeter gallows, whether their bodies were taken back to their home parish or buried in Magdalen Street.
Again, it's sort of tantalising and it leaves you with so many questions. But
exactly,
part of the fascination.
Yeah, I mean, if you know Magdalen Road well, it's where the almshouses are today. Those rather nice sort of red brick almshouses. The gallows stood right near there.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
that's the thing. You never look at these places in the same way.
No. I know whenever I walk through Exeter, I'm seeing the present day city, but I'm seeing the past city as well all the time.
Yeah, especially when, like, Timepiece, it's a great example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review. Things like that really help other people to discover the series and help to keep this project growing. If you've been enjoying the series so far, and you'd like to support the project further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/thepiskytrap. This podcast is completely independent, and it's funded entirely by myself, along with the help of listener support. And a monthly pledge on Patreon from as little as £1 a month helps me to cover the costs of keeping this project up and running, to pay for the platform fees, for recording equipment, and to get hold of important research books and materials, which all go into the prep for each episode. So, if you can offer a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be great. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, let's get back to the episode.
We've kind of spoken about a couple of examples of female individuals. One that also stood out to me is this chap, Richard Wilkins, who's accused in about 1600-ish, something.
Yes, that's when the rumours about him begin to spread that he is a witch. So you can see so often these individuals, they're people who've been suspected for a long time. The stories begin to spread. It takes a while before that builds up a momentum, and someone actually becomes so concerned or angry that they inform the justices. So there's usually a long tail to most of these stories that often, we don't know all the details of.
Yeah, it's that sort of backstory of what has led, and it might have been years or decades that have built up to the final
Yeah.
case being seen or heard.
And there are several of these cases in Exeter where people are, accused once, and then brought before the court and not found guilty, but then dragged back again a few years later. So, once these suspicions begin to build up, I think it takes a long time for them. Well, they probably stay with people for the rest of their lives, to be honest.
Yeah. What really stood out to me in this case is it seems to be quite animal focused. A lot of the
Yes.
accusations are around sort of like multiple pigs that have been killed through witchcraft and a horse and a cow.
Yeah. So again, in the Elizabethan Act, it specifically stated that that people who use occult powers to waste and destroy either humans or animals can be punished. And so throughout the early period, at least, there are lots and lots of accusations of witchcraft being used against livestock in particular. And this crops up again and again in Exeter, and certainly Wilkins seems to have used his powers, or was alleged to have used his powers, to attack both humans and animals.
Do you think that sort of hints at the life at this time could be quite precarious and people are so dependent on their animals and their livestock? There's these genuine fears about that's my livelihood. And
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you kill someone's animals, it could be, they would have no means of supporting themselves. Often, the cow or the horse was one of the most valuable things that someone possessed. So to lose that would be a disaster. And if you find yourself losing a whole series of animals for no apparent reason, it would be very easy to point the finger at the neighborhood witch, if you like. And also they had this belief that if medical complaints were suffered by either humans or animals that didn't seem normal, but seemed strange or unusual, we hadn't seen before, almost invariably they would then suspect that witchcraft had been used.
yeah, I guess unfortunately in Richard's case, he's sort of found guilty. And again, it seems like he was executed for these alleged crimes anyway.
Yes, so he's brought before the court initially in around 1600, as you say, and then 10 years later, he's brought back again. And this time there's a whole series of charges against him. They're all found, he's accused and he's found guilty on all those charges, except, interestingly, the charge of bewitching a group of pigs. And it does seem that as you begin to move into the 17th century, people are becoming a bit more skeptical about the whole crime of bewitching animals, and courts are increasingly unwilling to condemn people to death on those grounds alone. More and more it tends to be when they're actually accused of hurting or killing people and not just animals. So that's why Wilkins eventually goes to the gallows. It's on those charges of wasting and destroying people.
Something that's kind of cropped up in that is this sort of sense of accusations that might have been mounting up and sort of building up over years. That kind of ties in nicely to another case that cropped up, which is this couple, as I see in my head, the Crosses.
The Crosses, yeah.
Who's sort of, am I right in thinking John was a blacksmith?
Yes, yeah.
Elizabeth, his wife, and are they based outside the East Gate?
That's it. So they were basically in Paris Street. They lived very close to where the underground passage's entrance is now, just down Paris Street from Next. Fulford's the estate agents, I think, stands roughly where the Crosses used to live.
And it feels like they both kind of get accused of different things.
Yeah.
Initially sort of kind of tormenting or bewitching people, causing people to fall ill. But what I also find interesting, because it feels like they're kind of called up a number of times over years. There's like a gap in between. Initially, it seems to be the sort of people accusing them of sort of causing someone or family member to fall ill.
Yeah.
But then there's this interesting one where someone says they came into their yard and Elizabeth is said to have said, I'll be in that house in 7 years, as in, I'll be in your house in 7 years. It's a very clear threat, as they saw it, of, I'm going to get rid of you guys so I can live in that house.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she seems to have been quite a powerful figure. And you do get the impression that her husband is brought in very much. They're both accused of being witches. This is really interesting. Like, it's a husband and wife pair of witches. But you get the feeling that Elizabeth is the one that people are most frightened of. And she's actually accused by herself on another occasion. But interesting that, in England, as I say, it's a feminine crime. 90% of accused witches are women. But often the men who are accused will be associated with them in some way. And this is obviously how John is brought in through that connection with this, I would argue, probably more powerful and frightening wife.
Yeah, I do find it particularly fascinating. And what's also interesting is in some of the later accusations is, I think, is it an apprentice apothecary sort of says,
Yeah,
she made me not able to do my craft anymore. Like,
yeah.
I suddenly became rubbish as an apothecary, and he blames Elizabeth for that.
Yeah, I mean, there is this idea that witches have this power not just to hurt and kill humans and animals, but also to cause all sorts of things to go wrong. So, there are cases where people can't brew their beer, or they can't sort of churn their butter, and they blame the witch for this. So when things go wrong in the household, and this, as you say, is a really interesting instance of actually, a trainee apothecary who's finding that he can't mix medicines properly anymore. It's people sometimes feel as if something's gone wrong. I mean, we might in modern terms think it's depression, or it's just a general sense of, being unwell and not able to do stuff. And they think, why has this happened to me? And they turn to the witch that they've had some sort of run-in with.
Yeah, and I think that I also seem to remember that another blacksmith says that he couldn't work iron anymore.
Yes.
And I wondered if that was more of a kind of rivalry. It's a sort of a rival business, and it's kind of they're taking away from my trade.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's causing my problems? It's that other blacksmith. That's kind of a handy.
I think this is the thing, we have to be a bit cynical about this, that once that punishment is there, once you know that people will get into serious trouble with the law, they might be imprisoned for ages, they might conceivably be executed. I'm sure that unscrupulous people begin to use that as a kind of weapon. They may believe genuinely that, the rival blacksmith's wife is a witch, and perhaps he is as well, but it's a very good way of trying to sort of push customers away from them, get them into trouble, get them out of the way. And I mean, some communities, we shouldn't see all of these alleged witches in too rosy a light. Sometimes they are very difficult, troublesome, tumultuous people, and communities find them difficult to live with, difficult to deal with, and they would quite welcome perhaps some way of removing them from their midst.
And I hate to bring it back to sort of animals again, because this does seem to keep cropping up, and I find it really interesting. We get this woman in the 1650s called Joan Baker,
Yes,
accused of bewitching, I think it's the husband of Grace Matthews.
that's right.
But one of the witnesses claims to have seen her in her house by the fireside with a sort of toad in her lap, two more toads by her feet. And I guess it's coming to this idea of animals and familiars now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the fascinating things about Exeter, I think, is for so long there has been this idea that toads are actually familiar spirits. That's to say, little devils in animal form. And this motif of the toad familiar is still cropping up in Exeter in the Victorian times. So it stretches, all the way from the very earliest cases here in Exeter right up until the railway age. And I find that fascinating. But yeah, you're right. As we move later into the historical record in Exeter, we do see more references to these familiar spirits in the shape of toads above all, but also cats. And I think there's another case. Oh, I'm trying to remember what it is. There's certainly a cat, there's certainly a toad. Oh, and there's also a rat. Yes, a rat familiar.
Amazing. And the idea of familiars always sort of it intrigues me. And I wonder if it feels like here in Britain, especially, animals and animal familiars and imps seems to be a big thing. Do you think that's more a thing here in Britain, or is it quite a universal thing as you've...
No, it's almost uniquely English. So the idea of the familiar spirit is very much sort of individual to us. You do get some connections between witches and toads in Normandy, just across the channel. So there's a kind of hint that in that part of France, which is the closest to us, of course, there's kind of the same thing going on. But no, that's one of the things that makes the history of English witchcraft so interesting, that we have this very, very unusual belief in the familiar, which doesn't really develop in most of the rest of Europe.
And it crops up in little ways in some of the other cases that appear in Exeter as well. There's another one that stood out was a woman, another cross, Diana Cross.
Yes.
A kind of couple of years later in the sort of 1650s. I find it interesting that she seems to have been a sort of some kind of schoolmistress or running some kind of school.
Yeah. I mean, I found that really fascinating because most of the guys that we see prosecuted in Exeter they're pretty clearly at the bottom of the social scale. They will often be spinsters, widows, agricultural labourers in the case of Wilkins. But Diana Cross is very interesting, you say, because not only was she a schoolmistress before the Civil War, but she can clearly write because she presents or attempts to present a petition to the mayor. So she was clearly, a woman of some learning. I mean, we don't know how much, but, I would love to know more about her. I would love to have seen the petition that she presented to the mayor, but sadly that seems to be lost.
Yeah, she's comes across as quite a fascinating individual. And what's interesting is that one of the people who comes forward and gives their testimony is the mother of a child who'd been at her school.
Yes.
She was there for about a year. I moved my child to a different school, but then my child fell ill and died a few years later.
Yeah.
So did the schoolmistress at the other school she went to, and so did my first husband. It just feels like, I mean, there's quite a gap, so it feels like it's a little bit of scapegoating, maybe, but I do find it really interesting, the whole sort of schoolmistress thing and sort of moving them to a different school, that was the cause of the problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, again, it's just as you said with the blacksmith, it's the same sort of thing. There's this sort of rivalry going on there. And it's the idea that one of them, in this case, the schoolmistress, has used these dark powers to remove her rival. And I mean, yeah, it's I guess what happens is that people at the time, something bad happens or a series of bad things happen. And like all of us, they look for reasons. Why can this be? And they think, well, who have I fallen out with? Who could I have offended? Who could conceivably have done this to me? And even something that seems quite small, like taking a child away from school, as you say, if Diana had only had a very few children in the school and losing that one had made it not economically viable, it could have been disastrous for her. And then perhaps you could see, well, perhaps after that, she's dead set against me.
And this sort of continues into one of the other witnesses who comes forward is this woman who says, I think it's Jane Dicker, who says that Diana came to her door begging for something. So she's obviously fallen on hard times by this.
Yes.
And Jane sort of turns her away and calls her an old witch. But then later that evening, her child falls ill. And when she's tidying the house, she finds a toad.
Yes.
So again, this sort of refusal of charity comes in, and that the sort of toad possible familiar comes in.
Yeah. The idea that at this point Diana has sent a toad into that house, has sent a familiar toad or a devil in the shape of toad to harm the child, which is a really sinister thought. You can see how horrified she would have been at shaking out the blanket and finding the toad there.
I find it interesting that we get these themes that often cross through, and we kind of get the theme of violence again comes into it, because from what I remember, she's initially accused of bewitching the person of Joan Poole.
That's right.
That case is kind of, she's acquitted of that, it seems. But is it Joan Poole's sister says that her sister had been recovering at this almshouse from whatever the illness was. But then Diana appears and Joan kind of flies and attacks Diana. And so again, we've got this escalation to violence. But I wonder if this is part of sometimes something I often find cropping up in research, this idea of drawing blood.
Yes.
That's sometimes a factor of trying to sort of break the spell.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The very first case that we discussed, actually, Keith, was that of Maud Park. And obviously, Thomas Marshall, the man who suspects her of bewitching him, he goes down there with a knife and attacks her. Now, it may be that what he was trying to do is actually to shed copious amounts of her blood in order to break the force of her spell. So he may have really believed this, and that's what started the attack, because there are several cases where women are actually known to have been killed by men who attacked them in order to draw their blood and just went way too far. So, there's all these different levels of violence between literally just pricking someone with a needle to shed a tiny drop or two of their blood, and actually hacking at someone with a knife in order to, shed blood all over the place, and virtually everything in between. So there is always that potential for violence in this practice of scratching.
I think this is sort of one of the things that it makes me think of. One of the things that always draws me into these cases, but also folklore and local history in general, is that I'm always fascinated in trying to understand the mindsets of people in the Southwest in the past. And it feels like these cases provide a fascinating little glimpse into some of these earlier mindsets. But what do you think should be some of our sort of takeaways from some of these, or what were your takeaways from having researched and looked into some of these cases in Exeter?
Oh gosh, good question. I mean, I think one thing that really fascinated me was that there used to be this view that witch hunting came very late to the southwest, and it was suggested that that the 1650s, and particularly the Bideford witches in the 1680s, that they were a sign that Devon came late to the witch hunts, and actually. You can see from all the evidence in Exeter that almost from the moment that Elizabethan law is passed, people are beginning to accuse their neighbours in the city of being witches. So Exeter has a much longer history of witch prosecution and witch execution than anyone realised before. So that's something I've really enjoyed finding out about. Something I didn't put in the book, because I've only discovered it since, is that Alice Molland, she's supposed to have been the last executed witch. I've done quite a lot of research on her since, and I've discovered that very little, well, nothing is known about her except the idea that she was executed at that time. I've discovered another woman in Exeter with a name that was very similar to hers. I think it may have been Alice Molland, but if it was, and she was accused of witchcraft, she obviously survived, because this lady, Avis, Avis Molland, she went on to live much longer. So I've written a whole piece about Alice Molland and thinking that she may not have been England's last executed witch after all, but it may have been one of those 3 Bideford witches. So that's been really interesting for me. The other point I think that I'd make, Keith, which I think is also intriguing, particularly in terms of your purview, the area that you're covering, is that Cornwall doesn't seem to have any witch executions before the Civil War. So Cornwall, like Wales, appears to be a place in which the propensity to prosecute witches appears to have been much less than it was in Devon. And I do wonder if that has something to do with Cornwall and Wales having this separate Celtic culture that is just less fearful of witches and less inclined to see witches everywhere than the Anglo-Saxons on the other side of the Tamar are. I'd be interested to know what you think of that.
That's amazing. I think, yeah, it's something I definitely want to explore further, because it definitely feels like, especially belief around, if you want to use the term witchcraft or magical practitioners, especially when resorting to things like charms and healing or protection from potential ill wishing, that seems to carry on through into even the early part of the 20th century.
Oh, yes.
Beliefs. And
absolutely.
This afternoon, I'm off to the Liskeard Museum to look at some of the writings of William Paynter.
Oh, yes.
He was finding in the early 20th century. So some of that might tie in nicely to kind of what you think you've been kind of finding there. So it's an area that I aim to look into more. Do you think that it's a topic that's always going to continue to fascinate you, and that you'll always want to keep researching further?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Since that book appeared, I've done a lot more work in the archives, and I found quite a few more Exeter witches. So I'm planning, if I can, to do like a revised version of that book with all the additional people put in. And I'll probably end now with the story of Alice Molland and, was she executed or was she not? So, yeah, I think I'll always be interested in it, Keith. And I think the other thing is that I put a course on about this at Southampton about 15 years ago, and people said to me, oh, that's a bit niche. I'm not sure that's going to attract student interest. And actually, it's gone exactly the other way. And now there is a huge interest among students in this subject. So I think it's also, as an academic, it's really good to see that this is a subject which clearly speaks to, young people today. And it seems to me that really the interest in this subject has burgeoned since, the 80s and 90s, when I got interested in it, when it was still quite niche, but I would suggest it isn't anymore.
That was my chat with Professor Mark Stoyle. And a huge thank you to Mark for taking the time to chat. If you're interested in finding out more about the subject of witchcraft in Exeter, then I definitely recommend checking out Witchcraft in Exeter, 1558 to 1660. And I've popped a link in the show notes below to where you can get yourself a copy. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it and you found it interesting. Any thoughts or any questions, please feel free to get in touch. You can email me at thepiskytrap@gmail.com or drop me a message on social media. Instagram is probably the best bet, as I don't tend to check the Facebook page as often these days. Well, that's it from me. We'll be back again very soon to explore a different local topic. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.